One of my early actions as an MP was to table a private member's bill called the Tax and Financial Transparency Bill. And essentially that bill aims to do two things. The first is to tackle the scandalous reality that around 500,000 companies every year are not paying tax in the UK. Tax Research UK estimate that up to £6 billion of tax, and that's Richard, so if you want to query the figures, he's your man. Up to £16 billion worth of tax a year might be lost to the country as a result. And my bill would ensure that banks have to provide details on all accounts that they maintain for companies operating in the UK. That doesn't sound very onerous. It's a small change, but it would have a big difference, because that's what would allow HM Revenue and Customs and Companies House to chase companies who don't file returns and chase any tax they owe. And secondly, the bill would force companies to publish what tax they pay. Again, it doesn't sound very revolutionary, but it would make a big difference. And I think that all companies filing accounts in the UK should include a statement on the turnover, the pre-tax profit, the tax charge, and actual tax paid for each country in which they're operating without exception. Now, that information on where companies make their sales, record their profits, and pay their taxes is absolutely vital if we're to ensure that multinational corporations pay a fair and proper contribution to our society. And that's not only a responsible thing to do, it would also help reduce the deficit and provide a real and practical alternative to cutting crucial public services, the kind of vicious cuts that we're seeing up and down the country at the moment. And indeed, it's been estimated again that tackling tax avoidance and tax dodging could raise upwards of £100 billion annually as an alternative to public spending cuts. Now, sadly, the government isn't too keen on my bill. Surprisingly, I had a very nice meeting with them and they still weren't persuaded. And one of the issues they talk about is they dispute some of the figures that we're talking about, but actually the bottom line is that if we want to be absolutely exact about the figures, whether it's 60 billion or 80 billion or 100 billion, whatever, it's an awful lot of money. But if we want to be exact about it, well, let's have the companies publishing this information that we're asking for, because without that, nobody knows for sure what the total amount of tax owed is. The government also is keen to suggest that they're already doing as much as possible to tackle tax evasion and avoidance. Just last week, for example, they announced a deal with the Swiss banks that will force companies with Swiss-held bank accounts to pay tax owing to the UK. But crucially, at a rate currently significantly lower than the top rate of tax. Now, I've asked the Treasury some written parliamentary questions about this deal and hope to expose just how weak and flawed it looks set to be. And in fact, this is typical of the kind of gaping hole left open by the government's so-called clamping down on tax dodgers. Let me just give you one other quick example. UK banks have avoided paying £19 billion of tax on future profits by offsetting their losses during the financial crisis against their tax bills, according to a report by the TUC. And that's the equivalent to more than £1,100 for every family in the UK. Moreover, because of planned reductions in corporation tax, some banks will actually be better off once the Chancellor's bank levy is introduced. I mean, this is an Alice in Wonderland world, that because some of the words around tax are confusing, they hope that they can bring down a kind of a screen in front of our eyes and we won't see through some of the myths and the misinformation that is being perpetuated. And that's why this panel, I think, is so important. I want legislation to prevent banks avoiding tax and for any bank levy to be much fairer than the current one being proposed. And I said at the beginning that you'd be appalled by some of the things that you're going to hear this evening. And none more so, I think, than by the fact that many of those companies being ushered in to bid for our public services in this new age of competition and austerity are themselves tax dodgers extraordinaire. That's right. In other words, not only is the public picking up the tab when these companies don't pay the tax they owe, we're then having to swallow cuts in our public services as a result, and then we're having to pay those self-same companies to provide those services privately.
The deficit dominates all our discussions around politics. It seems that everything is defined by the cuts that we are to have. And I think that's the wrong political and the wrong economic message for this moment. And the reason why is that we in the UK have something called a tax gap. Until 2008, the government refused to recognise it, quite extraordinarily. The tax gap is the difference between the tax that should be paid in the UK if the intention of Parliament was actually fulfilled and the amount of tax we actually get. And it's made up of three parts. The first part is tax evasion. That's the biggest bit. And tax evasion can be summarised as cash in hand. That's the crude, simple, everyday version of it. It's the money that people don't declare that they've earned to HM Revenue and Customs. That's the simple bit. The more complicated bit is, for example, when companies and individuals submit tax returns that claim allowances and reliefs that they've never been entitled to. So tax evasion isn't just cash in hand. I estimate that tax evasion costs this country £70 billion a year. That's about 2/3 of the NHS's budget. This is a big number. The second part of the tax gap is tax avoidance. If I wanted to avoid this desk I'm standing at, I'd go round it. That's exactly what tax avoidance is. It's when companies and individuals go round the law. Those who oppose my argument say, oh no, tax avoidance is putting money into a pension fund, or tax avoidance is putting money into an ISA. Don't listen to what they're saying, they're just trying to excuse their actions. Putting money into an ISA is something the government intended you to do. Putting money into a pension fund is an allowance the government intended you to have. Arbitraging the tax laws so that we have companies, let's name one, Barclays Bank. Yeah, I'm going to get one ahead of UK Uncut here tonight by naming a culprit. We know Barclays Bank did this because The Guardian published a whole load of details on some of their tax schemes. So I'm not taking a libel risk tonight. We'll set up a structure which will involve a UK company and a Cayman Islands company and possibly a US corporation and maybe an Irish one thrown in for good measure. And some of them will be accounting using international accounting standards rules, and some of them will be accounting using UK accounting rules. And when you mix it all up in a giant melting pot and you add in a third party somewhere along the way, and some of them are companies and some of them are partnerships and some of them are various forms of S corporation in the USA, it's pretty complex stuff, and I assure you they pay fortunes to people in Barclays Capital to set up this stuff. Then mysteriously, if you send a few billion round in a circle, somewhere along the way, a few hundred million of tax isn't paid. That's the sort of deal that is called structured finance and is the basis of the leasing divisions of a large number of our investment banks, including Barclays. It's the most profitable bit of banking activity that any bank does in the UK. This sort of activity, arbitraging, playing off one system against another, is what those who don't want to pay 50 pence tax call entrepreneurship. No, it isn't, I assure you. This is abusing the tax system, and it costs £25 billion a year, in my estimate. I suspect, by the way, that's a drastic underestimate. But I err on the side of caution in my numbers. And then there's another bit of the tax gap, and that's the tax that people know they owe but haven't paid on time. So they've promised that the cheque's in the post, but it isn't. That's another 25 billion. That's the Revenue's own figure. I didn't have to make that one up, they admitted that one. Add the three together, and at any point of time, you've got £120 billion out there in the tax gap. This year's deficit is forecast to be £122 billion. Give or take, they're very similar. And that's why the tax gap is so important. Quite simply, we are in a situation where we have a choice available to us. We could decide, the government could decide, the Green Party could decide, this is the most important way in which we're going to try and close a deficit, which we've got. Let's be real, we have a deficit, we can't keep borrowing at this rate forever, we know that. So amongst the other things that the Green New Deal group and others will have promoted, one of the things we could do, apart from sensible investment, is also close the tax gap and in the process, of course, make the tax system fairer, which I'll mention but go no further with. The government's choosing not to do that. Caroline's mentioned some of the issues which I've worked on with Caroline, and I'm delighted to have worked on. She's referred to some of the work at the TUC. I write their tax policy too, by the way, I apologise. In fact, if you find any number on the tax gap in the UK, I probably wrote it. Sorry about that. It largely comes back to me. I seem to have cornered the market in calculating numbers on the UK tax gap. But when it comes down to it, because I wrote a report for the TUC in 2008 called The Missing Billions, which is still available as a download on their website, which started the tax avoidance issue, the government was forced to actually, for the first time ever, address this. And when they did, they came out with some numbers remarkably smaller than mine. Well, not that much smaller. 35 billion for tax evasion instead of 70, and 7 billion for tax avoidance instead of 25. Let me give you an example of how stupid their numbers are. They claim that the total tax avoidance in the UK on income tax, national insurance and capital gains tax combined, which taxes have a total collection of over 220 billion between them, is £1 billion. Last June 2010, George Osborne stood up in the House of Commons and presented his first budget and announced here closed gaps with regard to capital gains tax of more than £1 billion. Hang on, George, were you saying there was no tax avoidance on income tax at all? And none on national insurance because it was all capital gains tax and you had just closed it? No, your numbers are wrong. They come from a fantasy world of make-believe because the statistical basis on which the revenue worked is simply wrong. They simply still won't recognise the scale of the problem. But even if we accepted their number, the total, which I say is 120, would be 69 billion. So they admit there's 69 billion out there, and we're not collecting it. Tax havens, far too many tax allowances for the rich, which are far too easily abused. Far too many games being played by large firms of accountants, and I'll stand up and admit before you that I was trained by KPMG. I am a sinner. Reformed. Far too many members of my own profession, yes, I'm a chartered accountant, oh God, there's another sin confessed. Far too many of my profession spend their lives charging people a fortune to try to get round the law. And when we point out ways in which the government can address this issue, as Caroline has said, when we pointed out that 500,000 companies disappear in the UK each year without trace, when the average small company pays £10,000 a year in tax, that's their statistics, not ones I had to make up. I only borrowed theirs to come up with that number. And when you look at the fact that no income tax, no VAT, and all the rest of it will be paid as a result by those companies, sorry, couldn't help that bit, all of that will add up to that 16 billion, I estimate, of money lost. So we give them an agenda, and Caroline puts down a simple bill to solve the problem, and what do? Say, no, we don't think it's worth looking at that. They send out 1.9 million corporation tax returns a year. They only get 1.2 million back, and they don't think there's any problem with that. What are the other 700,000 doing, we said? You bothered to send them a return, but that's 1.9 million is still 800,000 less than the total number of companies in the UK, which is 2.7 million. So in fact, they only get 1.2 million returns out of 2.8 million. And yet they think that's all right. Why is this happening? What I want to put before you is the simple fact that the government is making a choice. The government is making a choice not to collect tax. When faced with the prospect of dealing with the deficit, or when faced with the prospect of providing decent pensions, providing decent benefits, good schools, investing in the infrastructure that we need, creating the environmental change that we all know is absolutely essential. When making those choices, they say, no, we don't want to do those things. We'd rather leave the money in the hands of the crooks. Because that's quite literally the choice that they're making. They are choosing to leave this money in the hands of the people who shouldn't have it and are denying us the opportunity for the public services we need. Or in some cases, the tax cuts that would take people who are having desperate difficulty in making ends meet out of tax altogether, which is also absolutely vital if we're going to create social justice, greater equality, and less division in our society. But they're not doing that. So what I'm asking you all to think about in however little time I've got left, and I don't know what it is, but I'm going to wrap up very soon, is to consider that choice and to consider what you can do politically about the option available to us. We'll never get all that 120 billion. You know, I'm totally realistic. But let's look at some very simple campaigning things we can do. We can support Caroline's bill. We can demand that companies must tell the revenue that they have a bank account and therefore probably have a tax liability, and therefore we won't let them be struck off the register of companies without owning up and making the payment that is due, or we will make their directors personally liable for it and go after them instead. We can demand country-by-country reporting. There is European legislation coming on it this autumn, extraordinarily. I'm amazed. But we are moving in the right direction, but it will require support from the UK, and we've got to make sure it comes. We can demand real action on tax havens, which we are a long way from getting. The UK-Swiss deal was a disaster. George Osborne has taken a grubby $5 billion and left banking secrecy in place in Switzerland for good. They are laughing all the way to, well, the bank, actually. We can demand that the revenue invest in the most obvious thing that they can do, which is more people on the ground. In 2005, there were 100,000 people working for HM Revenue and Customs. People who, in no small part, were picking up the phone and saying, "Where's your cheque? Can we have it, please? Can we have your tax return?" By 2015, there will be 50,000 people. The missing 50,000 won't be on the phone saying, "Can we have your cheque? Can we have your tax return?" And so it won't be going in. That's a choice. It's a saving. But as a result, we're not getting the money we need for the services we want to deliver the type of economy that will be the basis for our real prosperity in the future. That's what we're losing. We can demand those changes. And I'd like you to join with that if you would. Thank you very much.